Electrochemistry aims to establish a relationship between oxidation-reduction chemical reactions and electricity. It analyzes the link between the change in chemistry that occurs and the electric current that passes through a medium. Oxidation-reduction chemical reactions are also known as redox reactions. In a redox reaction, one or more substances experience a change in the oxidation state. A substance is said to be oxidized when it loses electrons and reduced when it gains electrons. Under normal conditions, the only type of energy absorbed or released during chemical redox reactions is typically thermal energy. However, when chemical reactions occur in the presence of two electric conductors, referred to as electrodes, separated by a conducting wire, an electric current is produced. To observe this phenomenon, an electrochemical cell can be set up. This typically consists of two half cells, with each half cell made up of an electrode immersed in an electrolyte. Electrodes are electric conductors or semiconductors which release or occupy electrons, while an electrolyte is a medium responsible for the transfer of ions. With regards to the experiment performed, the electrodes were made out of copper, while the electrolyte was a sodium chloride solution. When a potential difference is generated in the electrochemical cell, the negatively charged ions move towards the anode, which is the positively charged electrode, and the positively charged ions move towards the cathode, which is the negatively charged electrode. This transfer of ions in turn carries the current. A salt bridge is introduced in the experimental setup to complete the internal circuit, whilst making sure that the chemistry of the half cells is maintained. The salt bridge contains neutral ions and bridges the solution of the two half cells. For the purpose of this experiment, the salt bridge was constructed using filter papers folded together. Cleanliness is a very important factor in this experiment. All components were handled with rubber gloves, and the solution was never met with bare hands or other solutes. Thorough cleansing of the main components was necessary before setting up the apparatus. These components included two identical copper electrodes, two electrolyte containers, a thermometer, a stirrer, and all the necessary beakers. The experiment setup was prepared and the electrodes and stirrer were rinsed with the electrolyte before being set in position. The setup was allowed to thermally stabilize and the temperature in both water cans was measured. Once the temperature was ready, the voltage and current across the two electrodes were recorded. The solution in one of the water cans was agitated using the stirrer, and the same measurements were repeatedly documented and tabulated appropriately. For the second setup, the apparatus was arranged in an identical manner, with the exception of the solution contained within the water cans. It was made sure that the solution in the water can containing the stirrer was double of that in the other water can. This was done in order to observe the effect of the solute on the current and voltage passing through the circuit. Pitting is identified from a potentiodynamic polarization curve, as shown in the graphs of current density versus potential for both experiments, at the point with a rapid increase in the oxidation current. Comparing these graphs, it was noted that for experiment 2, a slight increase in the oxidation current could be seen, and thus it might lead to pitting. Polarization occurs in three forms: activation polarization, concentration polarization, and resistance polarization. The agitation of the solution in one of the beakers made electrons in the electrode to move about until they reach the surface of the electrode and leave the lattice to go into the electrolyte. This process is known as activation polarization, where in this case an anodic reaction is taking place. For experiment 2, it was noted that the current measured was larger than that in experiment 1, and thus implying an increase in activation polarization due to the linear relationship between the current and the activation polarization. This increase in both parameters was due to more energy required to break the bonds for the electron to be released into the solution. For both experiments, the composition of the electrolyte did not differ substantially for concentration polarization to occur. Agitating the solution leads to a reduction in the concentration polarization, Therefore, concentration polarization is almost negligible for both experiments. Resistance polarization has the biggest effect of all types of polarization. During experiment 2, the concentration of the agitated solution was doubled when compared to experiment 1, leading to more electrons being released in the solution and increasing the concentration of copper ions in the solution. In turn, this leads to an increased resistance to electron flow, as it would be more difficult for the electrode to travel from the anode to the cathode. As can be seen in both graphs of potential against current, the circuit potential and the current response relationship is linear, and so the ratio of the obtained potential and obtained current is defined as the polarization resistance, which is equal to 0.0005 volts per microamp for both experiments. From our voltage results of the first experiment, we noticed that the voltages values range from 0.002 and 0.026. The concentration of sodium chloride in water does not affect the pH of the solution. The concentration of copper was considered negligible with respect to pH change. Therefore, using a Courbet diagram, we have found that we are always in the corrosion region. For our second experiment, the solution was increased to double the amount in sodium chloride. This difference in both beakers produced an initial potential difference. This potential difference was a result of the imbalance in solution between the two beakers. The voltages recorded varied from 0.014 to 0.038 with agitation. Similar to the first experiment, these values indicate a similar region of corrosion. The level of agitation does affect the voltage produced. If the number of turns are increased with an automated or mechanical device, the passive region could be reached. Since in our case only people agitated the solution, only low voltages were produced, keeping our copper in the corrosion region. When the passive region is reached, the rate of corrosion is reduced drastically. Therefore, the copper would be in better operating conditions. The best operating conditions would be the immunity region, where the copper is thermodynamically immune from corrosion. Furthermore, a TAFL analysis was performed to determine the corrosion current density. However, the cathodic and anodic TAFL constants and estimates of the exchange current densities were also obtained. These values can provide information on the kinetic mechanisms of the electrochemical reactions, which can be done by observing the changes in values when changing the electrolyte composition. Finally, the Nernst equation was derived, which can be used to plot curves representing the positive and negative overpotentials.